My name is Peter Glambert, and on March 14th, 2024, I was 17 years old. I remember the date because it was my mother's birthday, and I was supposed to be picking up a sheet cake from the Safeway in Bend, Oregon. It was one of those high desert afternoons where the sun looks warm through the windshield, but the air still carries a sharp, jagged chill from the Cascades. I was sitting in my old Toyota Camry in the parking lot, the engine idling, when the world began to tilt. It wasn't a sudden snap. It was a slow, agonizing realization that my body was no longer mine. I felt a strange, cold pressure bloom behind my sternum, a sensation like swallowing a stone that refused to settle. I tried to reach for my phone on the passenger seat, but my right arm felt like it was made of lead. My fingers brushed the screen, knocking it into the footwell. I remember the sound it made, a hollow thud, and the sudden, terrifying silence that followed as my lungs simply stopped working. I wasn't gasping, I was just empty. I stared at a woman loading groceries into a white SUV 3 spaces down. She was wearing a bright yellow windbreaker. I tried to honk the horn, but my forehead hit the steering wheel with a dull click, and the horn didn't even sound. The medical report later called it an undiagnosed hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, a silent killer that usually waits for an athlete to sprint down a court. For me, it just waited for a Tuesday afternoon. I could hear the rhythmic tick-tick-tick of my turn signal, which I must have bumped as I slumped over. It felt like a metronome for my life running out. The edges of my vision didn't go black. They turned a sickly, translucent gray, like looking through dirty dishwater. I felt a drop of sweat slide down my temple and hang there, frozen. I couldn't blink. I couldn't move. I was a passenger in a suit of meat that had decided to quit. The last thing I heard was the muffled sound of someone's car alarm chirping twice. And then, the silence wasn't just in the car, it was inside me. There is a specific smell to a hospital that you never forget once you've died in one. It's a mix of floor wax, ozone, and an undercurrent of something metallic, like a penny on your tongue. I don't remember the ambulance ride or the panic calls my mother must have received on her birthday. My awareness snapped back into place while I was hovering roughly 4 feet above a gurney in Trauma Room 3 at St. Charles Medical Center. I wasn't a ghost in a movie. I was a witness to a frantic, ugly mess. I looked down and saw a boy who looked far too small for 17. My skin was the color of wet sidewalk chalk. A nurse with a messy bun was shearing my favorite vintage hoodie down the middle with heavy-duty trauma shears, the fabric screaming as it gave way. I felt a strange, detached pity for the shirt. Someone shouted, "Starting compressions," and a doctor, a man with graying stubble and a badge that said Dr. Miller, stepped onto a stool to get leverage. The sound of my ribs cracking under his palms wasn't loud, but I felt the vibration of it in the air. It was a rhythmic, wet thump crack that should have been excruciating, but I felt nothing but a heavy, still curiosity. I watched the monitor. The EKG was a flat, unmoving line of neon green that looked like a horizon on a dead planet. I heard the charge to 200 and saw my body jump, a mindless reflex to the electricity. My legs kicked out, and my head lolled to the side, my eyes half open and staring at nothing. It was humiliating to be seen that way, exposed, broken, and failing. I wanted to tell them to stop, not because I wanted to die, but because they were working so hard on something that was clearly empty. The room was loud, shouted doses of epinephrine, the clear commands, the squeak of rubber soles on the linoleum. But I felt like I was underwater, watching a movie with the sound turned low. I wasn't rising into a light yet. I was just stuck in the corner of the ceiling, watching the precise moment my life became a medical statistic. The hospital room didn't fade away so much as it was replaced. One moment I was looking at the top of Dr. Miller's balding head, and the next, I was standing in a place that felt like the absolute absence of noise. I wasn't in a tunnel, and there were no pearly gates. I was standing on a flat, vast expanse of what looked like dark, polished obsidian. It was cold, but not the kind of cold that makes you shiver. It was the cold of deep space, where temperature doesn't exist because there's nothing for heat to cling to. I looked down at my hands. They weren't glowing, they just looked solid, more solid than they ever had in the real world. I turned around and saw others. They weren't people I recognized, but figures moving in the distance, walking with a heavy, purposeful gait. There was a woman a few yards away, dressed in a plain hospital gown, looking at her palms and weeping without making a sound. The air felt thick, like walking through chest-deep water, and every movement felt intentional and exhausting. I tried to call out, but my voice didn't travel. It stayed inside my chest, echoing against my own ribs. Then, the horizon began to change. It didn't brighten like a sunrise, it pulsed. A soft, rhythmic amber glow started to beat like a slow heart against the darkness. I felt a sudden, crushing weight of every lie I'd ever told, every time I'd been cruel to my sister, every moment I'd wasted being angry at things that didn't matter. It wasn't a judgment from someone else. It was like the light acted as a solvent, stripping away the skin I used to hide my real self. I felt naked in a way that had nothing to do with clothes. I saw a figure approaching from the amber pulse. He didn't walk. The distance between us simply closed. He wasn't wearing a robe, and he didn't have a beard like the Sunday school paintings. He wore a simple, dark work shirt, his sleeves rolled up, and his face held a look of such profound, weary grief that it made my knees buckle. It was Jesus, but he looked like he had just finished a long shift at a job that was breaking his heart. He didn't speak with his mouth. The words just arrived in my chest, heavy and warm like a heated blanket. He looked at me, and for the first time in my life, I felt completely seen, not the me I projected on Instagram or the me who sat sullenly at the dinner table, but the raw, unedited version. He gestured to the vast, dark expanse around us, and suddenly, the obsidian floor began to shimmer, turning into a translucent window. I wasn't looking at heaven. I was looking back at Earth, but it was different. It looked like a map made of nerves and pulses. "Julian," he said, and the vibration of my name felt like it was reconstructing my molecules. "You are here because the clock has stuttered, but it has not stopped. You have to see what is coming so you can recognize the turn." He pointed toward a cluster of lights that I realized was my home state, Oregon. The light there wasn't white. It was a bruised, flickering purple. He told me that there is a specific season, a window of time, where the spiritual climate of the world shifts irrevocably. He called it the transit of the 5 springs. He explained that starting in 2024, 5 consecutive spring seasons would serve as markers for a global realignment. People look for fire in the sky, he said, his voice sounding like a low cello note. But the real change is in the blood and the soil. He told me that these 5 springs are linked events that cannot be undone once they begin. Each one is a seal of sorts, not on a scroll, but on the human heart. He wasn't talking about the end of the world in a cinematic way. He was talking about the end of an era of grace. He looked me in the eyes, and I saw reflections of familiar faces, neighbors, teachers, the guy at the gas station, all moving through their days completely unaware that the atmosphere around them was thinning. He told me that by the 5th spring, the world would be unrecognizable to the soul, even if the buildings still stood. I leaned forward, the amber light stinging my eyes. "What happens?" I whispered, my voice finally finding air. He waved his hand, and the translucent floor magnified. I saw a calendar page flip rapidly, landing on April 2024. "The 1st spring," he said, "is the spring of the veiled eye." I saw images of people sitting in pews, but their faces were blank, like erased sketches. He explained that a spirit of deep slumber would settle over the institutions of faith. It wouldn't be a grand apostasy. It would be a quiet, polite boredom. People would walk away from the truth not because they hated it, but because they simply couldn't feel it anymore. The warning about the church was about a collective loss of hearing. Then the image shifted to 2025. "The 2nd spring," he continued, "is the spring of the divided table." I saw families sitting down to dinner, but there was a physical barrier, a shimmering, invisible wall, running down the center of the mahogany wood. I saw a father reach for the salt, and his hand hit the barrier with a dull thud. His daughter sat 2 feet away, screaming, but he only heard a faint hum. Jesus looked at me with that same weary grief. This is the year where the choice is solidified. In 2025, the lines drawn in the sand become concrete walls. Conversations will end. Families will fracture over things they don't even understand, driven by a frequency they cannot tune out. He told me that 2025 would be the year the middle ground disappears. Everything would become binary, light or dark, with no shadow in between to hide in. He showed me a bank app on a phone screen. The numbers were spinning wildly, changing from green to red in a heartbeat. He said the stability of the world's math would begin to fail, and people would look to the sky for a savior but find only a mirror of their own fear. The The second spring is when the heart hardens into its final shape, he warned. I felt a cold shiver go through me as I realized 2025 was only months away. As he spoke of the third spring, the spring of the hollow harvest in 2026, the vision became terrifyingly personal. The floor beneath us didn't show a map anymore. It showed my own bedroom. I saw myself, or rather, the version of me that would exist if I returned. I was standing in the kitchen of the apartment I hoped to rent after graduation. I was holding a phone, and my hand was shaking. I watched as a text message appeared on the screen from a name I recognized, Maya. She was the girl I'd been in love with since sophomore year. The message read, "I can't do this anymore, Julian. You're seeing things that aren't there. You've changed, and I'm scared of you. Don't call me again." I felt the phantom pain of that rejection rip through my chest in the obsidian void. Jesus stood beside me, silent. He wasn't comforting me. He was letting me feel the weight of the cost. He told me that 2026 would be the year of the personal fracture. To hold on to the truth of what I was seeing now would mean losing the people who refused to see it. He showed me my bank balance. It was $4.12. I saw a notice on the door of the apartment, "Eviction proceedings initiated." He explained that in 2026, those who carried the warning would find the world's systems, economic, social, and legal, slowly closing their doors. It wasn't a sudden ban. It was a series of glitches and policy updates that would leave me on the outside. I saw myself sitting on a bus bench in the rain, clutching a Bible that looked worn and tattered. I looked older, my face lined with a stress that no 18-year-old should know. "This is the price of the third spring," Jesus said. "The harvest is hollow because the world will try to feed you husks while you starve for the word. You will have to choose between the comfort of the lie and the loneliness of the light." I wanted to scream that it wasn't fair, but the amber light just pulsed, steady and unyielding. The obsidian floor beneath my feet didn't just show images anymore. It began to vibrate with a low, sub-bass frequency that made my teeth ache. Jesus pointed to a date that shimmered into existence, March 2027. "The fourth spring," he said, and his voice took on a jagged, metallic edge, "is the spring of the echo." I saw a vision of a massive, modern church sanctuary, the kind with stadium seating and million-dollar lighting rigs. But as I watched, the pastor on stage wasn't speaking. He was just moving his mouth in silence. Behind him, a giant LED screen was broadcasting a digital version of him, but the digital version was saying something entirely different. He explained that 2027 would be the year of the Great Imitation. This is the direct answer to what happens inside the churches. He told me that a technology of the Spirit, something far older than AI, but using it as a skin, would begin to inhabit the pulpits. "The sheep will follow the sound of a voice they think they know," Jesus said, "but the shepherd is a broadcast, not a being." I saw a congregation of thousands weeping and lifting their hands to a holographic projection that looked exactly like the Christ I was standing next to. But this projection was telling them that the struggle was over, that the new earth was already here, and that the laws of the Spirit had been updated for a modern age. The fourth spring is when the direct deception takes hold. He told me that the outcome of this spring is determined by one thing: discernment of the gut over the eye. Those who rely on their physical senses will be swept into a collective trance. I saw people in the vision receiving a digital blessing on their devices, a shimmering code that acted as a passport to normalcy. If they accepted it, their faces smoothed out into a terrifying, vacant peace. If they refused, they became invisible to the censors of the world. Jesus looked at me, and his eyes were like dying stars. In 2027, the church becomes a mirror of the world's desire, and only those who love the desert will find the well. The amber pulse intensified until it felt like it was scrubbing the very thoughts from my brain. We reached the final marker, April 2028. "The fifth spring," Jesus whispered, and for the first time, I felt a breeze in that void, a wind that smelled of ozone and wet iron. The spring of the threshold. This was the climax of the vision, the event that the previous 4 years had been building toward. I saw a global map where the borders weren't lines of ink, but walls of fire. He explained that 2028 is the year of the irreversible shift. This is what determines the outcome for every soul on the planet. It's not a war of bullets, but a war of frequency. He told me that a specific sound would be released, a harmonic of the earth, that would be marketed as a tool for global healing and peace. In reality, it was a vibration designed to sever the human spirit from its ability to repent. By the fifth spring, he said, his hand resting on my shoulder with a weight that felt like a mountain, the door is either locked from the inside or thrown open to the abyss. There is no more almost. There is no more tomorrow. He showed me the streets of a major city. It looked like Seattle or Portland. People were walking in perfect, synchronized rhythm, their movements fluid and uncanny. They weren't slaves, they were optimized. But as I looked closer, I saw that their shadows were missing. He told me that the outcome for those who survive the fifth spring is a life of radical preservation or complete integration. You either belong entirely to the system or you belong entirely to the wilderness. There is no middle class, no suburban safety, and no private life left. The fifth spring is the final harvest, where the wheat and the tares are not just separated, but moved into different dimensions of reality. The vision of the city faded, and I was back on the obsidian floor, alone with him. The amber light was now a blinding gold. Jesus stepped closer, and the worker appearance he had before began to peel away, revealing something so terrifyingly bright I had to look at my feet. "Julian," he said, and the ground cracked beneath me. "The title of your return is a debt you owe. You are being sent back not to live your life, but to occupy a post. You are a sentinel of the five springs." He laid out the direct explanation. The five events linked to spring are the markers of a grace down. Each spring from 2024 to 2028 represents a 20% reduction in the restrainer's presence on Earth. By the end of the fifth spring, the shield is gone. He told me that what changes is the physics of evil. It will no longer have to hide in the shadows. It will become the light itself. The people affected are those who love the world more than the truth, and what determines their outcome is their willingness to be hated. "You will return to a body that is broken," he said, his voice now a roar that felt like silence. "You will return to a family that will think you have lost your mind. You will witness the first spring within weeks of waking up. You will see the church you grew up in go silent in the spirit. You will see your friends trade their souls for a feeling of safety." He reached out and touched my chest, right where the stone had been in the car. "The warning is this: do not seek to save what is already burning. Build the ark of your own spirit, because the fifth spring is a flood of shadows, and only the light you carry inside will keep you buoyant." I felt a sudden, violent tug at the base of my spine, a sensation of being sucked backward through a straw at 1,000,000 miles per hour. The transition wasn't a peaceful drift, it was a physical assault. One second I was standing in the presence of a light that felt like the sun pressed against my skin, and the next, I was slammed back into a cold, heavy cage of bone and meat. The first thing I felt was the dry, abrasive scratch of a plastic tube down my throat. Then came the pain. A blooming, jagged fire in my chest where they had broken my ribs to keep me here. My eyes snapped open, but the overhead lights of the ICU were so sterile and white they felt like needles. I tried to gasp, but the ventilator fought me, pumping rhythmic, mechanical breaths into my lungs with a hiss that sounded like a mocking snake. A nurse appeared over me, her face a blur of blue scrubs and a pale mask. "He's back," she whispered, her voice sounding thin and tinny compared to the resonance I had just left. "Julian, stay still. You're in the hospital. You're safe." But I wasn't safe. I felt the weight of the five springs sitting on my soul like a lead shroud. I looked at the digital clock on the wall, March 15th, 2024. I had been clinically dead for over 8 minutes, but I had lived a lifetime in the amber void. As the sedatives began to pull me back down into a forced sleep, I caught a glimpse of a television mounted in the corner of the room. It was muted, but the news ticker at the bottom was scrolling rapidly. Something about a global religious accord and a new era of cooperation. I felt a cold knot tie itself in my stomach. The first spring, the spring of the veiled eye, wasn't coming. It was already beginning to breathe. I tried to lift my hand to point at the screen, to warn the nurse, to tell someone that the quiet boredom Jesus spoke of was already drifting into the room like a gas. But my fingers only twitched, and the darkness took me again, heavy and silent. 3 weeks later, I was back in my bedroom in Bend. The doctors called my recovery a statistical anomaly, but I felt like a stranger in my own skin. My mother was hovering, her eyes red-rimmed and filled with a desperate kind of gratitude that made me want to scream. She kept talking about how lucky we were, but every time I tried to tell her, absent now, less like a pedestal of authority and more like a heavy, wooden anchor. I was staring at my banking app on my tablet. I remembered the woman on the bench in the vision, the way the numbers spun into a null value. I refreshed the screen. The numbers were there, but they felt like ghosts. The first proof happened on a Tuesday morning. I received an email from the synagogue's administrative board. They were implementing a new community security protocol for the 2026 fiscal year. It required all staff and clergy to link their personal biometric data to a centralized ethical conduct database to maintain our nonprofit status and insurance. It was framed as a mundane administrative update, a way to streamline operations. But as I read the fine print about real-time monitoring of public statements to ensure communal harmony, I felt the cold blade behind my sternum again. I called Mendel. I wanted to tell him about the vision of him and David, about the spilled wine. But when he answered, his voice was tight, distracted. Avram, I can't talk long. David and we're having some issues. He's joined some group, talking about systemic resets and digital sovereignty. He's acting like a stranger. I looked at the white tablecloth on my own dining room table, pristine and clean. I knew that in a few months, in Mendel's house, that wine would spill. The future was leaking into the present, one broken relationship at a time. The warning wasn't coming. It was already here, silently restructuring the world while we argued about the weather. The final confirmation came not from a vision, but from a small, plastic card. Yesterday, I went to the pharmacy to pick up my heart medication, the thin pills that keep my rhythm steady. The pharmacist, a man I've known for 15 years, looked at his screen and then looked at me with a strange, guarded expression. Rabbi, I'm sorry. The system isn't authorized to dispense this under your current risk profile. My risk profile? I asked, my voice steady but my hands beginning to shake. I've had this insurance for decades. It's the new 2026 pre-compliance filter, he said, lowering his voice. Your recent sermon, the one you posted online about the digital net, it was flagged as socially destabilizing content. Until you complete the digital literacy recalibration, your non-essential services are suspended. He pushed the empty prescription slip back toward me. I looked down at it. My name, Avram Belinsky, was highlighted in a pale, sickly orange. I walked out of the pharmacy into the crisp afternoon air. I reached into my pocket and felt the small, leather-bound book of Psalms I always carry. My heart gave a sharp, familiar pang, not a heart attack, but a recognition. I looked at the people walking past me, their eyes glued to their shimmering screens, their thumbs scrolling into the coming fire. I looked at my own hand. In the pale sunlight of Brooklyn, I could see a faint, nearly invisible scar on my palm that hadn't been there before my death. A small, jagged mark in the shape of a cross. It is the only thing I have left that feels real. I sat on a park bench and watched a dry leaf skitter across the pavement.